Why should Canadians believe you'll do anything differently, though, than Justin Trudeau?
I think we have the same values and we try and achieve the same ends.
Rent prices are up nearly 6% year over year.
Last March, more than 2 million people turned to a food bank, up 90% from 5 years ago.
Ottawa's deficit is now nearly $62 billion.
Despite the federal government's attempt to crack down on guns, it seems
monthly income.
Food bank use in Canada has reached a new record high. Several people who tally food banks today.
In a recent interview, Carney faced tough, unrelenting questions from Rosemary Barton, a political reporter, in an attempt to reveal whether Carney could hold his ground under pressure or buckle when confronted with the messy realities of politics.
You have proposed that big polluters pay consumers through a carbon credit market with the industrial pricing system. So you get rid of the carbon tax for consumers and you would put this in place instead. How would you ensure, though, that those costs aren't passed on to consumers?
Canada is in the midst of an economic crisis, with rising inflation, unaffordable housing, and deepening concerns over government spending. Voters are looking for real solutions, not vague assurances. Meanwhile, the political landscape is shifting, with Pierre Poilievre dominating the conservative narrative and Trudeau's Liberals struggling to maintain public trust. In this environment, Carney needed to prove that he was more than just an expert on economic theory, and that he had the leadership skills and political instincts to navigate the storm. As we move forward, I'd like to ask you a quick favor to subscribe and like this video. It takes just a second and helps us so much. The reporter, well aware of the significance of this moment, did not hold back. Every question was designed to challenge Carney's credibility, expose inconsistencies, and force him to take clear stances on controversial issues. From economic policy to energy projects to his personal business dealings, nothing was off limits. The conversation took a turn when the topic shifted to U.S. tariffs, one of the biggest economic concerns for Canadians.
The issue that is of most concern to Canadians right now, and that is, of course, the threat of tariffs by the president. You have said that you are leaving this to the real-time negotiations to the Prime Minister, but you could be faced with all of this in a matter of weeks. So what is your plan to take on the president's tariff threats specifically?
Well, so if I am selected as leader of the Liberal Party and therefore Prime Minister, I'll do a couple of things. One is I will pick up where we are at that point. There are negotiations ongoing. They go back and forth. As we all know, the president changes his mind or raises different issues day by day, and so the government has to deal with that. So I'll pick things up where they are. But one thing I want to emphasize, and what I can talk about and have been talking about, is one of the most important things we can do for Canada, but also for the negotiations, is to concentrate on what we can control. We can't control President Trump, but we can control what we do here at home to reinforce our economy. So that's middle-class tax cut, that's investing in infrastructure, it's building new trade routes, it's doing all these things. It's having one Canadian economy instead of 13. And what I'm being more and more clear about is exactly how I would do that if I am selected.
With President Trump's history of imposing unpredictable trade barriers and Canada's reliance on cross-border commerce, the question was simple. What would Carney do if faced with tariff threats from the U.S.? But rather than offering a clear plan, Carney avoided the question, deflecting to ongoing negotiations and insisting that he wouldn't interfere with discussions already in motion. The reporter wasn't satisfied. Canadians, she argued, deserve to know exactly how a potential prime minister would handle a major economic threat, not vague assurances that he would pick things up where they are. If Carney truly had the expertise he claimed, why couldn't he outline a basic strategy?
And I will ask you some of those questions, but I still think that it would be helpful for Canadians to know exactly what you would do when it comes to tariffs. So why are you being so reticent to talk about that?
Because I'm a good negotiator. I have negotiated a number of situations in the past. I know how to manage crises. I know what you do in the order you can control things. It is not a good idea to insert yourself in the middle of a negotiation, give conflicting signals.
Other candidates are doing that.
It's not a good idea to do that. Full stop. Right. And I'm in a position where I take my responsibilities or my potential responsibilities seriously. I'm in contact. I understand where the state of play is, and as much as possible, we need to move in with very, very deliberately. Another point I would make is I'm not looking to negotiate. If I am selected as leader and therefore prime minister, my interlocutor, the person I would negotiate with, is the president,
right.
Not with others. And so again, it's important at that stage. And last point, if I may, it's not appropriate for me at this point to have direct contact, obviously.
No.
His response that he was a good negotiator who understood how to manage crises only reinforced the reporter's skepticism. If anything, it raised more concerns. Negotiators plan ahead. They don't wait until the last minute to figure things out. Despite repeated attempts to get specifics, Carney refused to budge. Instead, he leaned on broad talking points about strengthening Canada's economy at home, tax cuts, infrastructure, trade diversification, without addressing the immediate issue at hand. The next issue was the carbon tax. Carney, hoping to distinguish himself from both Trudeau's Liberals and Poilievre's Conservatives, made a proposal. Scrap the consumer carbon tax and replace it with a carbon credit market, where big polluters would pay into a system that rewards cleaner alternatives.
You have proposed that big polluters pay consumers through a carbon credit market with the industrial pricing system. So you get rid of the carbon tax for consumers and you would put this in place instead. How would you ensure, though, that those costs aren't passed on to consumers?
So there's a couple of things. First, and just to be clear, in terms of removing the consumer carbon tax, that also means we're removing the carbon tax for small, medium-sized enterprises, for farms and others, basically everyone up to 50 kilotons of emissions. So it's the large polluters that pay. Now, those large polluters today, what they try to do is reduce their own emissions. If they don't get to certain levels, depending on the sector, they pay the producer carbon tax, the OPBS system as a whole, as you know. They have an option to buy carbon credits, which reduces the tax they pay. That market doesn't function very well. That carbon credit market doesn't function very well. So what we're actually doing here is improving the market, improving how it functions, adding additional credits, so additional options for those large polluters. They could buy these credits. This federal government will stand in between. And what's going to be new is a series of new incentives for households to reduce those emissions.
It still sounds to me, though, that there's an opportunity for companies to pass that on to consumers.
Well, just to be clear, them buying credits reduces their cost.
On paper, it sounded like a win. No more direct carbon tax for individuals, while still holding corporations accountable. But the reporter wasn't buying it. Right away, she pushed back on a critical flaw. If companies were forced to pay more for emissions, what was stopping them from passing those costs on to consumers? Carney, caught off guard, insisted that giving businesses more flexibility in how they reduce emissions would keep costs in check, but the logic didn't hold. If companies had to pay, they would find a way to recoup their losses, most likely by raising prices. Sensing an opening, the reporter zeroed in. So, just to be clear, she pressed, you're saying consumers won't pay more under your plan? Carney hesitated. Then, in an almost offhand remark, he admitted that consumers were already paying more. The entire premise of his pitch was a relief for working Canadians.
Okay, but you acknowledge that the consumer would pay more at some point.
Well, the consumer is already paying more. Just to be clear, the consumer is already paying more. These are marginal amounts, and two things are happening. One, with our plan, is that it gives the companies more options. It gives households, Canadian households who are hard-pressed. Look, I was across the prairies, it's minus 30 in the prairies. It'd be good to be able to insulate your house better, to drive other efficiencies. So it helps that. And may I make one other point, which is one of the things we have to be able to do as Canada is we have to get our companies more competitive. It's a big bad world out there, it's a big bad world out there. The people with whom we are more likely to trade with, now that our closest trading partner is attacking us, cares about carbon emission reduction. You look at the European Union, look at the major... So
I need to move on. I need to move on.
But now he was acknowledging that rising costs were unavoidable. Tax cuts are always a crowd pleaser, and Carney knew it. With the cost of living rising and Canadians feeling squeezed, he made a bold promise: broad-based tax cuts for the middle class. On the surface, it was an easy win. a pledge to put more money in people's pockets. But the moment he put the idea on the table, the reporter pounced on the obvious question. How are you going to pay for it?
We don't have a lot of time. And you are saying that you're going to take away the carbon rebate, obviously, as well as the carbon tax, right? So, and you're promising a middle-class tax cut.
Yeah.
Who are you targeting? How broad is that, and how will you pay for it?
Okay. First off, thank you for raising that, because one of the core points is we don't just say axe the tax and then walk away. Don't care about our companies, don't care about their competitiveness, don't care about taking away the rebate. That's what Pierre Poilievre does. Pierre Poilievre doesn't care about the implication of his actions.
Well, he's going to give a tax cut as well. But
he doesn't twin the two, doesn't look, doesn't think the add up, doesn't think it matters. We'll do a broad-based middle-class tax cut. We'll release the details of that in the coming weeks as appropriate, and we'll show that Canadian households are coming out ahead.
will you balance the budget, and how quickly?
A couple of things there. One of the things we're going to do later this week is go through our new fiscal, what I would propose as our fiscal rules. Core to that is to reduce spending of the government, so to balance our operational spending over the course of the next 3 years. To be absolutely clear, what that means in terms of operational spending, it is all the programs that the government runs. It is the transfers to provinces, which, as you know, health and education transfers. It's transfers to individuals. It's debt service, which continues to increase as government goes on. So we will balance that over 3 years. Where we are willing to borrow is to invest and grow this economy. That is an absolute crucial point.
So there'll be a deficit.
It is a fundamental difference between the approach the government has taken up until now.
Rather than offering a straightforward explanation, Carney danced around the details. He hinted at future announcements, suggested that economic growth would help cover the costs, and spoke about responsible fiscal management. But none of that answered the central issue. Where exactly was the money coming from? If Carney was planning to run a deficit, as his previous statements had suggested, then how could he justify cutting taxes at the same time? Deficit spending meant borrowing more, and borrowing more meant either raising taxes elsewhere or cutting spending on key programs. So which was it? Would Canadians get lower taxes but fewer services? Or was this just another political promise with no real plan behind it? Carney once again sidestepped the question. He fell back on economic jargon, talking about investing in the future and ensuring long-term sustainability.
Of how President Trump is feeling on one day or another.
You talk about building new infrastructure, including pipelines. Do you support the idea of a west-east pipeline?
Look, I support the concept. I also know that Canada is a federation. First, let me say a couple of things. One is that we, as a nation, need to build some new pipelines for conventional energy. There are several options that are on the table. Some of them are quite advanced. Others of them are not. The Energy East, to use that term, has not progressed that much. It could restart, but there's not currently a sponsor. There's not progress there.
Would your government be a proponent of that pipeline if it were to start again, given that the government bought a pipeline in the past?
A couple of things. One is that what my government would do is, and we've signaled this very clearly, we would use extraordinary powers of the federal government in order to accelerate the approvals for such pipelines, to accelerate the approval for clean energy.
Like repealing C-69? What does that mean?
We have extraordinary powers on impact assessment as well as others, and we can delegate authority. But let me make a core point. Which is Canada is a federation, so we take decisions. There's not one decision maker here. If you listen to Pierre Poilievre yesterday, as you probably did, he didn't mention the provinces once. He never mentioned First Nations. He acted as if it's just his decision to fly in somewhere and decide which pipeline happens.
Pipelines have long been a political minefield in Canada, and Carney knew he had to tread carefully. When asked about his stance on new pipeline projects, he took the safe route, stating that Canada needed to build more infrastructure for conventional energy. But when the reporter asked him about a specific project, a potential west-east pipeline, his confidence wavered. At first, he claimed to support the concept of the project. But support for a concept isn't the same as support for an actual pipeline. When pressed on whether his government would actively push for it, his response became noticeably vague. He acknowledged that there were several options on the table, but he avoided making a firm commitment, pointing out that Energy East, in particular, hadn't seen much progress and currently lacked a sponsor. Sensing hesitation, the reporter dug deeper. If Carney truly believed in the need for pipelines, why not take a clear stance? The Trudeau government had previously gone as far as buying a pipeline to ensure its construction. Would Carney do the same if needed? Instead of answering directly, he shifted the conversation to process, talking about the importance of consulting provinces and First Nations, ensuring proper environmental assessments, and navigating regulatory hurdles. While those are all important factors, they weren't the answer the reporter was looking for. The issue wasn't whether those steps should be taken. It was whether Carney would actually push the project forward if faced with opposition. His reluctance to take a strong position was telling. Was he avoiding controversy, trying to appeal to both pro- and anti-pipeline voters? Or was he simply unwilling to commit to a decision that could define his leadership? The moment the reporter brought up Carney's past role with Brookfield, the trajectory of the interview changed. Until that point, he had been fielding tough questions about policy and leadership. But now, the focus turned to something more personal.
When you were chair of Brookfield Management, you took on that role with the Liberal Party to advise the Prime Minister about economic growth. At the same time, Brookfield was looking to create a Canadian fund, was trying to get access to Canadian pension funds and federal money. Were you part of that bid, and was that appropriate?
I was not part of that bid. I'm not sure I recognize the full description of how you said it, but I was not part of that, no.
You resigned from more than 20 corporate boards, I think?
Not corporate boards. Most of those boards were philanthropic or charities.
You are not yet subject to ethics requirements.
I don't have any power, Rose.
No, but would you put anything out there for Canadians to better understand your business dealings and your financial picture before you're elected?
Obviously, I'm going to comply with all the ethics guidelines, conflicts of interest guidelines, blind trust, all.
But during an election, before you have a seat, would you be willing to show Canadians what they're dealing with and what you've been dealing with?
Well, let's be clear.
Yeah.
Okay. I was UN Special Envoy for Climate Action. I was chair of chair of Brookfield on a number of philanthropic boards and did a lot of charity and other work. So that's all disclosed in the public domain. I will immediately subject myself, if I am elected Liberal leader, of course I'm going to immediately subject myself to all the ethics guidelines, conflicts of interest guidelines, other guidelines, in order to pursue.
His business dealings. Specifically, the reporter wanted answers about Brookfield's attempt to gain access to Canadian pension funds and federal money, while Carney was advising the Liberal government. Carney immediately denied any involvement in the bid, but his response lacked the crisp clarity that might have put the issue to rest. Instead of a firm and direct, "I had nothing to do with it," he hesitated, claiming he didn't recognize the full description of events as the reporter had framed them. This only raised more questions. If he wasn't involved, why wasn't he saying so more decisively? Did his role at Brookfield overlap in any way with his government advisory position? No, it was only a matter of time before it was obvious that Carney wasn't exactly the most relatable candidate. He had spent decades in elite circles, governing central banks, working on global finance, rubbing shoulders with world leaders and billionaire investors. But could someone with that kind of background understand what it was like to struggle with rent, groceries, or stagnant wages? Carney, anticipating the attack, responded with numbers. He rattled off statistics on Canada's median household income, the rising cost of living, and how inflation had impacted essentials like food and housing. He framed himself as someone who not only understood the problem but had the expertise to fix it. But numbers alone don't connect with people, and the reporter saw the gap. She pointed out that reciting statistics isn't the same as experiencing the struggles firsthand. It's one thing to know that housing prices have skyrocketed. It's another to live through the stress of being priced out of the market. It's one thing to see inflation figures on a spreadsheet. It's another to decide whether to buy groceries or pay the heating bill. Canadians aren't just looking for a capable economist. They want a leader who truly gets what they are going through. Despite all his credentials, Carney still has to prove he is that person. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.